Harassment Assessment Risk Profile. It's a web-based assessment tool developed from empirical research, clinical literature, stories from stalking victims, and case studies. SHARP provides an assessment of the big picture of the stalking situation. We're thrilled to have TK and Terry here to present this information. This webinar is being co-hosted by the Stalking Resource Center and by the Battered Women's Justice Project. Thanks to OVW for funding. And Michelle Garcia, Director of the Stalking Resource Center, is here. Michelle?
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to the Battered Women's Justice Project for co-hosting this webinar with us. We are thrilled to have TK and Terry presenting this webinar and so many people joining us for this exciting new resource to provide risk assessment in stalking cases. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Stalking Resource Center, we are funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to provide training, technical assistance, and resources to communities seeking to enhance their responses to stalking. So we are the resource nationally on all things stalking, working with professionals providing training, individual case assessment, policy development, and a wide variety of resources. If you're not previously familiar with the Stalking Resource Center, we encourage you to check out our website, which is ncvc.org/src. We have numerous materials as well as other trainings, webinars archived on our site, and please don't hesitate to contact us if in any way we can be a resource to you in the work that you're doing in working with stalking victims or offenders. Thank you. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle. And the Battered Women's Justice Project. For those of you who are unaware about our office, we provide training, technical assistance, policy analysis, and consultation on the most promising practices of the criminal and civil justice systems in addressing intimate partner violence. Staff members have particular expertise in assisting jurisdictions around the country to implement coordinated interagency responses to intimate partner violence that maximize victim safety and offender accountability. And now I'm going to introduce a little bit about our presenters. TK Logan, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Behavioral Science, College of Medicine, and the Center on Drug and Alcohol Research at the University of Kentucky, with joint appointments in psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and social work. Her research and writings focus on stalking, protective order effectiveness, sexual assault, intimate partner homicide, and health disparities of women with partner violence experiences. Dr. Logan has conducted a comprehensive study on the effectiveness of civil protective orders and the costs and cost-benefit of protection orders. Dr. Logan has also conducted about 15 different studies on partner stalking and has some of the most extensive information about stalking in the nation. Dr. Logan's books include Women and Victimization, Contributing Factors, Interventions, and Implications, and Partner Stalking, How Women Respond, Cope, and Survive. Terry Farragher, MSW, is the Executive Director of the Domestic Violence Prevention Board, a local coordinating council on family violence in Lexington, Kentucky, and the President and Treasurer of Outrage Us. She has worked as a victim and community advocate to end interpersonal and family violence for over 30 years. Ms. Farragher has spearheaded a variety of collaborative community projects aimed at protecting and supporting victims and holding offenders accountable. She was the primary author of a model protocol for the development of CCRs and the co-author of the 2009 Kentucky Civil Protective Order Study. And now I believe, Carrie, you have some polling questions.
I do. So we just want to get to know a little sense of who's all on the webinar today. So you should have seen your screen just pop up. The first selection we're asking is just let us know what your profession is. And we have a list of professions. If you could just select what works best for you, that would be great. I'll give everybody just a couple minutes here, and you just click on the circle next to your choice. And of course, if something doesn't fit, feel free to put it in the chat box. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I will close that first question out. And just to let everybody know, we have 81 advocates on right now, 14 mental health and caseworker agency, 10 school and campus personnel, 12 other victim service agency, 11 attorneys, 8 law enforcement, 3 prosecutors, 8 probation and parole. Don't have any judges, at least at this point, and 3 other criminal justice system agencies. All right, and then the next question we have is please let us know if you're currently using kind of formal assessment with stalking victims. And the selection is yes, no, or sometimes. It sounds like somebody may have unmuted themselves. So if any participants have done so, please mute yourself again. All right, and I'll go ahead and share number 2. It looks like we have 18 yeses, 109, 20 sometimes. And the next one is, have you worked a stalking case in the past 6 months? That's a yes or no. All right. Well, we have 9 no's. And I think here some background noise. So all participants, make sure you are still muted. All right, and then the last question we have is, are you currently working a stalking case? And we have 45 yeses and 100 no's. Thank you all so much for your feedback, and we'll send this right over to you, TK.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here today, and especially want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women as well as the co-hosts. I first want to acknowledge the collaborators on this SHARP tool, my colleague Robert Walker, who has almost 40 years of clinical experience, and the programmer that you'll see did an amazing amount of work on this, Jeb Messer. And Terry Farragher was a collaborator in the community and went through multiple versions of this with me, and I appreciate her being here today. And then many who have provided it, tested, and feedback along the way. This was a long haul coming to this point, and I'm certainly not done yet, but it's been a long haul, and I'm especially grateful, and I wouldn't even be here right now if it wouldn't have been for the feedback from the Stalking Resource Center, Michelle and Rebecca Drakey, and from Marika and a variety of other people at their Battered Women's Justice Project. So thank you to everyone. Today, I'm just really going to spend some time sort of describing what SHARP is, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile, how we got here, why it's here, sort of how it fits in with what's already out there. Terry's going to talk a little bit about how it might be used for communities, and then if we have time, we'll actually do an online demonstration. So just starting with a very simple definition of stalking. It is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that induces fear or concern for safety. What I know from talking to lots and lots of stalking victims is it feels more like a prison without bars. I've been studying stalking for almost 20 years, and I would say stalking is one of the things that haunts me, in part because often when someone's being stalked and they talk about their experience, it's often dismissed, denied, and minimized. And I don't mean just by criminal justice system agencies. This can happen with friends or family, other agencies. And I think that means their voices are silenced, and I would say that probably is what motivates me in my stalking research and keeps me going on this topic. So stalking as risk is one of the first things I want to talk about. So when you think about risk assessment and stalking, there's sort of two ways to think about that. One would be, is stalking part of several other risk factors? And so are you assessing violence or the likelihood of violence, the likelihood of lethality, the repeat assault, or likelihood of criminal justice recidivism, where you're looking at a number of factors, and stalking is just one of those factors? Or are you looking at stalking as itself as a risk and trying to look at the features of the stalking situation to look at safety planning or offender management or whatever else, a risk of what's going to come next? So I'll talk a little bit more about that. in a minute. And so when we do assessments, there's sort of two main types. This is very general. One is informal, and that's what we're doing. Every time we hear a story, we're sort of informally assessing risk immediately. That kind of risk assessment is our gut. It's an ongoing, and also, we definitely consider victim prediction and what the victim is feeling in that case. And then there's more formal assessment. And when you look at the formal assessments for stalking, there's a number of them out there. I'm going to talk about three main ones that I have seen in the research literature for the longest. The first one is Guidelines for Stalking Assessment and Management by Kropp, Hart, and Lyon. The second one is the Stalking Risk Profile, the SRP, by McKinsey. And then, and there's a bunch of authors on that. And then there's the Stalking Risk Checklist with Sheridan and Roberts. The first two that I talked about, the SAM and the SRP, are what is called structured clinical judgment approach. So it's a set of structured questions that were based on clinical literature and the research on stalking. And both of those assessment tools have a strong emphasis on management of the offender. And so they're invaluable tools. They do cost money, and they can be time intensive as well to complete the full interview. And then each one sort of approaches stalking risk assessment with their unique framework. So the SAM assesses basically sort of the nature of the stalking behavior. This is just very simplified. They're complex tools, and I would really encourage everyone to take a look at both of them. They really have great features. But the second factor the SAM assesses is sort of the offender risk factors. And then third, they focus on some specific victim vulnerability factors. And then what they do is you take those risk factors and play out different risk scenarios with respect to looking at the nature, severity, the eminence, and the frequency/duration of future stalking and violence. And that this whole approach with these risk scenarios, I just really love that approach with stalking and think that's a big strength. The SRP looks at the stalker motivational type, and they have 5 different types based on research. So the first thing you want to do for their instrument is figure out what kind of motivational type of stalker, and then you move into a risk assessment for a variety of risks: violence, persistence, reoccurrence, or psychosocial damage to stalkers. And then the stalking risk checklist was based on responses to a web survey of stalking victims. And then some logistic regressions were done to predict stalking violence and serious stalking violence. And what's great about it is it's 11 items, and it is free. It's accessible, very easily accessible. And then with each item, it sort of explains why that was a risk factor. So it's a very useful tool as well. And they assess the 11 questions kind of look at victim fear, past history of violence, stalker substance use, and then selected tactics within that situation. But so what we're saying is that SHARP is complementary to all those other tools out there, and stalking is very complex and dynamic, and so whatever tool fits a situation is what is important to use. So SHARP's a little bit different than the others, but would be a complementary. The goals of SHARP is really to assess the bigger picture of the stalking situation. So it is really looking at those features of stalking. It doesn't use a risk score or anything like that. We use what's called sort of a risk profile to contextualize the situation and to really focus on a wider range of harms from stalking than some assessments focus on. And then the third goal is to educate whoever, whether it's a user, the victim, or friends and family, or an advocate or whatever, about some of the risks associated with stalking and offer some safety suggestions. And just quickly, we have some next steps that we want to take into this, and we've already gotten a lot of feedback on it, but one of the next steps is getting more of that feedback, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The development of SHARP was based on a specific framework that is currently based on all the research, kind of pulling it together. Like I said before, we piloted this, and it's been through numerous versions and gotten lots of feedback, and we're in that feedback level 2 phase right now. It's free, and let me just say this was not funded, so this was just what I did in my spare time for fun, what we all did. So it hasn't been funded, and it is accessible. It's 43 main questions. We're estimating it takes about 15 minutes, but it depends. It is flexible, so you don't need any kind of training or background to be able to do it. And we also made it, it's a web-based tool, and I'll talk more about this, but victims, professionals, friends, and family. So it's flexible to be able to be used with whoever is interested in getting more information. Once you fill out the 43 questions, main questions, and then there's some sub-questions underneath it, it will then give back a narrative report, 2 of them actually. So the first one is sort of a summary of the story of the stalking, that bigger picture. It's within the framework, and we're going to go through the framework. And it's usually about 2 pages long. And then this particular narrative is written in a third-party perspective, so it's not going to say you or anything like that, and I'll talk more about that. And part of that third party is written so people can, again, get the bigger picture perspective. And then the second narrative is a safety management narrative that has safety suggestions tailored based on the way the questions were answered. And we're going to go back through these narratives and sort of that framework, but I did want to give you that bigger picture. So just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we had when we developed SHARP. So the first is, and I've already talked about this a little bit, stalking behaviors are very dynamic and complex, and they are intentional and deliberate. So that means that the assessment or framework, one size doesn't fit all. It can look very differently. And the second thing is that fear is cumulative over time. So that context is critical. The third assumption that we had is that risk is much bigger than just violence. Violence is an important part of it, but so is the persistence or escalation. And so just the fear that this is just going to go on forever, that the target or the victim often feels that this is never going to stop, or not even knowing when the end is. There's a risk of harm or harassment to others that not only keeps the victim in fear, but actually also often actually plays out as a real risk. And then there's the piece that probably is my biggest soapbox lately, which is the life sabotage that is being done intentionally or maybe unintentionally, but it's not just the stalking itself or that being hunted itself, it's just even the consequences of that. So making sure that we consider that and get that into the story as well. And that can affect victims' fear, distress, and just exacerbate everything. And that's sort of the fourth assumption, that the harm or that devastating impact on life from stalking is cumulative over time. And this quote was recently, Helen DeWitt recently talked about her personal story of being stalked in the London Review book, and she had a really good quote about that life sabotage piece, that money melted away, debt mounted, work was disrupted, friends were tired of the drama, and there was always some new game to be played that provoked someone profoundly unstable. So just the overview and the framework of SHARP. So like I said before, it is a web-based tool. This is right now the website that you go to, courseofcontrol.org. This is the website. And then you would just hit this right here, enter a stalking and harassment assessment and risk profile, and that's how you would get to it. When you get started, it's going to ask the name of an offender or suspect, or the gender first, and then the offender name or initials. So what I'm going to use here is my partner's name, and he hates when I use that, but his name is Mark. So, and what that's going to do is each question is going to be tailored with that name or those initials in it. And then it'll ask offender age. It will then ask target gender and target name or initials, and I'm going to use Terry or TF for that. It will ask the age, and it will ask about the relationship between the offender and target, and we have a number of relationships listed. And then we're going to ask who is answering the question. So if it is the victim, the questions then will be tailored online to that victim. So it would say, have you experienced something from Mark? If it's a friend or a family or a professional, then the questions are going to say, has TF or has Terry experienced something from Mark? So that helps to keep the question very clearly focused. So the key components of the framework include three main things. So intentional course of conduct that makes an implicit or explicit threat that causes a reasonable fear or concern for safety and is unwanted. And so each of those components within the three components has some subparts to it that we'll go through. So starting with that first one, intentional course of conduct. One of the goals to assess this is obviously to show how stalkers are maintaining that unwanted relationship with their target. And when we look at this and think about assessing tactics, when we're trying to first kind of pull back and look at the big picture, to be able to articulate succinctly the stalking story, you know, there are a couple of different ways to do it. And one is to endlessly, you know, get this whole list of tactics that might be going on. But what we know, and this is actually Gavin DeBecker's quote, who wrote the book, The Gift of Fear, a stalker's imagination ends where ours, or it begins where ours ends. So we can't possibly list all the tactics. But what we did was look at all the research, all of the things, the stories that we know, and we kind of clumped them into four main functions of tactics. So the first one that we looked at was just all the different tactics that go into surveillance or monitoring a target's time. The second sort of cluster function that we came up with is sort of this life invasion, and that's all those unwanted contacts. The third sort of cluster was intimidation. So that's the threats or threatening to harm themselves and forced confrontation and just those intimidation tactics. And then the fourth one was this idea of interference by sabotage or attack. And so what we term this, the acronym for it is SLI, so the surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference. And so in the assessment, there are 5 questions actually assessing each one of these: surveillance, life invasion, intimidation. There's 2 questions, one for life sabotage and then one for attack of the victim, the physical or sexual attack. And surveillance, I just want to point out, is an important tactic. The research shows that when someone is being followed or time being tracked by that stalker, victims themselves are more likely to recognize it as stalking themselves and label it that way, and so is the general public. The next thing is to kind of assess these 3 dimensions, what I call DIF patterns. So what is the duration? How long has it been going on? how intense is it? So how many different locations, how many different tactics, and how frequent is it? And frequency, we focus on specifically frequency of approach. So intensity, let me just take you back. So we asked 3 questions about that. Does Mark regularly contact or harass you? And these are yes, no, in more than one way, in more than one location. And has the behavior increased in frequency or severity? So we're getting at some escalation there. And then frequency, we ask about days in a typical month that an unwanted contact was initiated, they were directly approached or confronted, and how many days in a typical month was did he or she significantly interfere with your life? And the assumption there is that when you take those SLI strategies, the surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack, those strategies, and lay them out with the duration, intensity, and frequency, it shows patterns over time, and patterns show intent. The second piece of this is the reasonable fear. When you're going to look at what are the implicit and explicit threats, the fear level, and then the context of those threats. So first, what we know from the BJS study is that all stalking victims, 57% said they had not experienced an explicit threat, yet they were afraid or concerned for their life. So we just have one question in there trying to assess that implicit threat. Has Mark left objects, made gestures, or said things that were threatening but were not direct threats? And then we ask about threats to hurt or kill, which we're used to seeing, especially the closer the relationship between the target and the stalker, the more you'll probably see those explicit threats. And then we ask a number of other questions about the threat. In particular, has the stalker described in detail how he or she plans to harm you? There's some research showing that's almost like violence ideation is what it's called. And so the more detailed and graphic those threats are, the more dangerous that can be. But we also ask about threats to harm or harass others, threats to destroy property, harm pets, or sabotage you in other ways. And then we ask about proxy stalking. Has the stalker had other people, like his friends or family members, threaten or intimidate, stalk, or attack you? For the fear dimension, when in the protective order study, we assessed a wide range of fears because that's one of the things Mary Ann Dutton's work showed is that victims of domestic violence often fear multiple things, and that's true with stalking victims as well. They certainly fear physical harm and death, but as it's higher, almost higher, at the same level or almost higher as the physical harm, the fear of ongoing harassment and control, that social financial harm and harm or harassment of close others. And then I see in some of our work in rural areas, we see much even higher rates of this harm, fear of harm or harassment of close others, and an actual of that. So it can be dependent on the community context as well, those different fears. And then we have 3 response options for fear, so not at all, somewhat, or extremely, to try to get at what are they most concerned about. And we certainly ask that, have you made you afraid or concerned for your safety, concerned for the safety of others, actions, and then afraid or concerned about significant financial impact. Then we ask, how capable do you think the stalker is of harming you or close others? And then we also ask, have you taken any actions, or has the stalker's actions contributed to significant life changes for safety? And that one is really important to sort of think about corroborating that fear. And because sometimes people don't want to say they're afraid. They don't want to admit they're afraid. They don't necessarily hadn't thought about how afraid are they. So it's important to really look at the behavior. How do you know if someone's afraid? You can think about life or personality changes, any extraordinary efforts they've spent to deal with a stalker, and that can include both time to get a protective order, time off work, as well as money. And money, often you think about maybe any kind of safety measures they put in place if they were able to afford that. Any witnesses of fear and life sabotage is certainly, the more life is disrupted, the higher the fear usually in research. And then we assessed just sort of the unwanted component of this, so the victim resistance and stalker persistence. And right now we have several questions asking that. So we have a question about whether or not the stalker has been notified that this harassment and stalking is unwanted. Have they been informally or formally notified? And then we go a step further and even ask, have they been notified that no contact is wanted? We ask whether there's a court order, whether there's been a court order violation, and then if they've been, maybe there's no court order violation, but if they've been notified that the stalking harassment is unwanted, has the stalker persisted? And one thing that we found in the protective order study is that about half of women who got a protective order, our 210 women that we studied for the National Institute of Justice project, half of them said they were being stalked before that protective order was issued, that year before. And we know that stalking before the protective order is associated with stalking after the protective order. And that persistent stalking was associated off the map with protective order violations and with more violence. But what we also found, and we actually have done 2 studies following women who have a protective order, and that comes up to over 1,000 women, and half from rural, half from urban. But what we found is that 55 to 65% stopped stalking after that protective order. So it was really those 35 to 45% that persisted. So, and then we do kind of look at this context of threats. And the way I think about the context is kind of twofold. One is sort of looking at the credibility of the threat, documenting why the threat's credible. And the other side is sort of looking at what is that unique vulnerability that that target or that victim has to this stalker at this point. I mean, one of the things that interests me about stalking cases is a lot of times if you have a stalking case, you can go back in history and see a pattern of stalking over time. So one of the questions I have is sort of why this woman, why this time? And really trying to assess that context and safety plan around those unique vulnerabilities. So there are 4, and this is based on the whole violence literature, which says violence is situational. Not all violent offenders are violent all the time. In fact, most of the time, they spend the vast majority of their time in nonviolent activities, and at the same time, everyone's capable of violence. So what they have come up with is sort of 4 main situational factors that help us kind of get a better handle on when violence might be more likely to occur, what factors to consider. And that's the history of the offender mindset, the dynamic, and the environment. And so we have 4 response options for these questions, which is no, it doesn't, that is not a factor, yes, suspected or unknown. So the first one is sort of who is the stalker and what is he capable of, and that's the history. What's the history of violence and control and jealousy with that target as well as with others? What is the criminal history? Is there a criminal history? Are there substance use problems and or serious mental health issues? Have there been suicide attempts or thoughts in the past? Does he possess guns, have an obsession with weapons, or have a military law enforcement background? And then we ask about the technological expertise. And that is an important vulnerability factor just for looking at the vulnerability of the victim to be exploited through technology and just adding that piece. And then the second factor of those four in the context is, what is the stalker's mindset? And so this literature sort of says to destroy or damage someone is power. It's not necessarily about violence, but it is really about that life sabotage as well, and maybe violence, maybe not. And so the three main things there are just looking at that motivation. So there's rejection or humiliation, the justification, revenge, blame, you've ruined my life, and then what's called last resort thinking. So consequences, whether that's dying or going to jail, no longer seem to matter. So in that, we just ask about 3 questions. So do messages from the stalker or Mark suggest he feels rejected, humiliated, or degraded in some way? Has Mark indicated he wants revenge or blames you for ruining his life? And does Mark seem unconcerned about severe consequences, such as going to jail or dying? And then we ask some questions about that dynamic. Often what we see is that victims of stalking are overwhelmed. They have no idea what to do. And many of them will just try anything to get peace and to protect their loved ones. A couple of things in particular that we know influence the dynamic is that if it's a partner stalker, there's more, probably more interaction going on. And partner stalkers tend to be more threatening, more persistent, more likely to follow through on threats, more likely to attack, more likely to interfere, insult, and just use this in much more intense and frequent than non-partner stalkers. Not that they don't do all of that as well, but it's just an important factor to think about when thinking about that dynamic. And the other thing about partner stalkers, obviously, is they know a lot of information about the victim, and they know a lot of things that bother the victim. They know lots of ways to kind of interfere, sabotage her life. And then the duration, intensity, and frequency, sort of that patterns of the stalking are probably going to impact that dynamic or some of the different ways that the victim is going to respond. So we assess that by just asking a few questions about that. So, and one of them is making sure to assess for any upcoming events or situations that the victim might think may escalate the Mark's behavior or violence or the stalker's behavior. We do ask if do you feel you might have sent Mark some mixed messages, and then we ask, do you feel that the stalker is aware of the things that he's doing to you, bothers or upsets you, and then do you sometimes feel bad because he's depressed, had a hard life, and had some difficult things happen? And we use a lot of this, too, when in the safety report and the safety suggestions. And then how is the environment facilitating or hindering the stalking? So we ask the target if they feel there have been limited or no consequences for that stalking, harassing, or threatening behavior. And if they feel they're more vulnerable to the stalking, harassing, or threatening behavior because there are things about the environment that limit their ability to be safe. And the things we ask about are if they work or go to school at the same place with the stalker, if the stalker is in a position of authority over the victim, the stalker lives or works near the victim, if they have children or common and or have child visitation, custody support issues, if she's living in unsafe housing, have limited access to resources, and if they are isolated or have limited access to safety measures. And that is basically the 43 questions. And then we end with 2 open-ended questions. So whatever gets typed into these questions are going to come out on those narrative reports. And the first question will come out on the risk narrative, and it just asks anything to add about the unique aspects of the case. Again, with stalking, it's always a surprise. There's always something different. And then the second one on the safety narrative, this would come out just any specific safety concerns or recommendations to add. And so that is sort of the framework. And then the risk factor profile, there are 12 basic factors that we look at. The first one is just that comes out, we'll just talk about the course of conduct in terms of how they answer those questions. Just going to be a quick little summary. And what we do, so we'll say you have 12, this case or this situation has 12 of the 12 basic risk factors assessed, or 11 or 7 or how many ever, and that sort of, these again are just the basic things that we should know in every stalking case, but not necessarily the only ones. So like I said, the course of conduct, the diff patterns and the sly strategies with special attention to frequency and intensity. The escalation, which includes those upcoming triggers, potential upcoming triggers. The nature and the context of threats. How detailed and graphic, have they followed through on threats before? Court-ordered violations, the stalker motive. So the rejection, humiliation, justification, last resort thinking, whether there's proxy stalking, whether they have possession of weapons, and then some of their history factors, whether they have a history of partner control, jealousy, violence, history of violence and abuse to other, criminal history, substance use problems, or mental health, and then the technological expertise, and then specific vulnerability factors. And so, like I said before, the first narrative that comes out is a risk profile, the narrative and profile, and it's just usually about 2 pages long. And the sections are sort of just that framework I just kind of followed, the course of conduct, duration, intensity, frequency, threats, fear, concern for safety, resistance, persistent, context, and then it'll, at the very end, give that risk profile. And of course, definitely we talk about, stalking especially, things can change over time. So you want to potentially think about constantly assessing these risk factors. And then the safety management tool report, this sort of follows what I call steps in response to SLY. So the first thing that we want to do, the first thing that it talks about is just what is going on, to see it and validate that it's stalking, or label it as stalking, or as the Stalking Resource Center says, see it, name it, stop it. And then the second piece, it'll talk a lot about the threat and kind of based on the way the questions were answered, what is that unique vulnerability in this situation. Then we'll talk about the importance of evidence and documentation, in particular, how important that protection piece is, self-protection and active safety, and that it's got to be ongoing, and then support, how important it is to seek support. And this narrative is quite a bit longer, maybe more like 4 or 5 pages. And I'm going to give the phone over to Terry.
Hello, this is Terry Farragher, and I want to echo my thanks to the Office on Violence Against Women, the Battered Women's Justice Project, and the National Stalking Resource Center for hosting this webinar. As was stated in the introduction, I'm coming from the community perspective. I've been director of a local coordinating council on domestic violence for a long time, and our council enjoys the participation of all the primary agencies, so we are multidisciplinary in nature. We also have a couple of multidisciplinary teams in our community, fatality and near fatality review team, and a high-risk response team that we call Red Flag team. So I come from a community that utilizes a variety of tools in a variety of settings, including various risk and lethality assessments, but currently no single assessment or profile is applied uniformly to all cases, including all stalking cases. I need to advance this, don't I? Sorry, I just realized that. So as many people on this webinar know, one of the challenges in stalking cases is the incident-based approach that is common in addressing most crime, including most domestic violence crime. So I've used the metaphor of a snapshot to illustrate that approach, with each incident viewed as another snapshot, basically. So we know when we look at individual incidents out of context, they are more likely to be dismissed. Family, friends, and professionals are less likely to understand the gravity of the victim's situation. If we limit our focus to incidents, then we tend to limit our response to interventions that address those incidents. And I think that's true whether you look at it on an individual or a community level. And, so we really limit development of strong community responses if we are just addressing, stalking and other acts of domestic violence as incidents. Snapshots may suggest an underlying narrative, but they don't provide one. Of course, stalking forces us to consider context, to establish a course of conduct and reasonable fear, and often we try to do that by stringing together multiple incidents. That's helpful, but I would argue that a series of snapshots creates an album. But we're still missing the power of the full story when we do that, the true meaning or threat that underlines the collection of the stalking incidents. So this is one of the things I like about SHARP, is that I believe it more effectively captures the context of coercive control and illustrates the collective threat posed by the stalker and the reason for fear on the part of the victim. So it moves the portrayal of the victim's experience from an incident-focused snapshot to a more dynamic and complete picture like a film. Did it move forward? Yes, it did. So SHARP facilitates the creation of this dynamic narrative that I'm saying is more akin to a film. And I believe that narrative is very powerful and validating, most importantly for victims, but for whoever that story is shared with. It helps people get it. It provides that aha, now I understand, now that I'm looking at this whole picture put together. And I think it particularly helps them understand the 24/7 ominous nature of stalking and harassment. It fills in the background, just to create that more complete picture of stalking, and then brings up the question, where is this going? So SHARP isn't predictive, but it does give us some indication of where the stalker is headed and where we might be able to most effectively intervene or shut the stalker down. One of the problems with addressing stalking is that it often feels very chaotic. Of course, this is particularly true for the victim. The stalking and harassment behaviors may be all over the map, and it can feel very overwhelming. So I think SHARP helps us to identify the patterns and better understand the chaos and put it in perspective. It heightens our understanding of risk, and for the victim, it may initially even heighten some levels of fear, but it also sheds light on how to intervene effectively. In that way, it helps us clarify information that we need to take action. So for victims, I believe this can validate their intuition and trust in themselves to guide action moving forward. And I believe that this helps victims to take control of fear rather than letting fear control and incapacitate them, which I think is a fairly common response. So how is it useful in the community? I'm going to talk a little more about, particularly its use for victims in a minute. So with victim advocates, though, one of our main jobs, I believe, is to reflect what victims tell us back to that, and to have that imbue everything that we do, really. The importance of that kind of reflection is probably most obvious in safety planning, but it's also true in our other interactions with victims. And I think that SHARP can help to distill that narrative and bring a deeper understanding to all of our advocacy efforts and how we approach safety planning. And it can also, I guess, encourage us to be creative in terms of identifying resources by pinpointing particular areas of vulnerability. For law enforcement, it's probably most obvious there because it helps identify patterns and course of conduct, sources of evidence and witnesses, potential interventions, and avenues to enhance safety and protection. And much the same for prosecutors. That narrative can be used as a guide to build the case, basically. Looking, beyond, some of the initial professionals involved, victims interact and share their stories, of course, with multiple people and multiple providers in most cases. And I think one of the advantages of SHARP is that victims can use it to avoid continually repeating their whole story. I mean, once it is on paper, they have that story and they can share it with others as they see fit. Each of the professions or institutions or relationships that I have listed on this slide can find the SHARP narrative useful in some ways, as some of the ways I've already mentioned, but also in ways I don't have listed here, and hopefully in ways I haven't even imagined. But I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. For example, an employer or a faith community might use it to inform how they can manage risk in a given situation, risk to the victim and risk to others, to coworkers or other members of the faith community. A probation and parole officer might use it for help in determining how to monitor an offender, to find points where they might want to make contact or make surprise visits even. A therapist might use it as a beginning point to help a victim process their experience. And a judge might find it useful to determine if GPS monitoring is appropriate for a stalking offender. On a community level, you see CCRs on this slide. SHARP can, I think it'd be very useful in identifying, assessing the community and identifying where there are breakdowns and barriers and gaps. I think it's a helpful tool for case review teams. And again, hopefully, not only in looking at individual cases, but looking at issues and barriers in the community, and then using it to carry that forward and, help with determining programs that need to be developed and collaborations that need to be built between agencies. So we have to remember, though, that it's the victim's narrative, and so I did want to highlight that victims should direct its use. As with any tool or instrument or any document that we create related to a victim, we need to be cautious and diligent in considering how the information might be used or misused by the wrong people. So it's always important to know the limits on confidentiality for your agency, especially if you're going to have a copy of it, and to inform the victim of those limits. There is a caution on the tool itself, so this is brought to victims' attention also. And then lastly, I'm going to borrow the Missouri version of the advocacy wheel, which is adapted from the Duluth Power and Control wheel, to highlight some of the ways that SHARP can empower victims of stalking and harassment. And I'm starting kind of at 2 o'clock on that wheel. Believe and validate victim experience. I believe the entire tone of SHARP is one of validation, and I find that to be one of its greatest assets for victims. I think to see their story written on paper, and they can add to it, they can change it, but it's very validating to see it all put together. I know many of us encourage victims to journal if it is safe, certainly to document, to employ documentation logs, but I really think seeing that narrative is just something different. I just think it's very powerful and validating. Moving on down to the right, acknowledge injustice. Again, SHARP places the onus for the behavior on the stalker, but it helps the victim identify action steps to manage risks. and jumping over to the other side, help victim plan for future safety. It hones in on some of the most serious areas of vulnerability and suggests steps to take to address those vulnerabilities. So it is a big help, I believe, in planning for safety. Promoting access to community services, I think it does certainly encourage victims to access services, but it also promotes creative thinking about those services and resources. And, I know that we've certainly made some connections maybe with, more unusual resources to address some vulnerabilities in stalking cases, things like senior volunteers in the community or whatever. When you, really start examining the narrative, I think it helps prompt some creativity. And then the two I haven't mentioned so far are extremely important because it should be implemented, as I said, with respect for confidentiality and respect for victim autonomy. One of the things I like about SHARP is that while I wouldn't just hand a victim most danger or lethality assessment tools to fill out on their own, because I think most of them by design need to be accompanied by advocacy services, I do feel that SHARP is appropriate for victims to complete independently. And I really don't feel that way about a lot of the tools. Of course, I think all tools and interventions are more valuable when accompanied by advocacy services, but for some victims, SHARP might be the step toward those advocacy services because it does encourage reaching out for help and services in the community. So I am going to stop there and pass the phone back to TK. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. I wanted to kind of go back just for a minute. One of the reasons that we felt like the narrative was so important, which was a ton of program to even pull that together, is that one of the things I noticed in talking to victims and about their story, I mean, we would interview them for a long time to try to get the full story and their frustrations with getting help and it seemed to me like one thing that happens sometimes in cases is that there's just so much going on, and Terry mentioned this. So what that narrative, the goal with that was to help victims sort of articulate the big picture in a coherent way with some important sound bites. And as I said before, it's printed in third party, so it doesn't say you said this or this happened to you. It will say however you put that in, whether it's TF, this is happening to TF by Mark or however. So and that the research on putting a story into that third person sort of perspective is it helps even the victim to see the bigger picture. It's sort of emotionally distancing, and so there's some research on that. I don't really know, but that was some of the background for why we did that. And I suppose the other thing that can happen when you're asking a victim is they can tend to get distracted by all these strange things that are happening, these tactics, and when we want to get that bigger picture and then move in on where we need to be focusing for safety. The second thing that I didn't mention is about the report. So after, and we can demonstrate this if we have time, but after you finish all the questions, it will pop up that your narrative is in the process of being put together. The narrative is only up on the web for a few minutes, and if you don't grab that and download that to your hard drive or to something, it'll be gone forever. It cannot be recreated. You would have to completely answer all the questions again. But it is in a Word doc, so that then you could take and customize or tailor that even more, add more to it, or make it add some of the evidence notes or whatever. And, I just want to go back to the limitations of SHARP. Again, I see this as only a tool, and there are other tools out there to potentially use this with. And the goal is really about education and information. It's not a prediction. It doesn't give a score. And I also want to say, you know, like I said before, so we're at this level and we're still seeking feedback. And so hopefully some of you today will be able to use this and give us some feedback. And we're working on some other things with it and trying to get, I was thinking about, can we make this shorter? It's a little bit longer than I would have liked initially. And then getting some funding for more research on this. But so I don't know, Carrie, do you want to go to the demonstration or take questions or what?
Well, you know, we still have half an hour left, so let me go ahead and I can share the screen if you want to go through that. I think that'd be great.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me go to the case study first.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to use a case study with Julia, they're young, 22 years old, and Justin. They've dated for a couple of years, and of course she broke up with him. He had a bad temper. There was some history of violence there. And as soon as they broke up, he began calling and texting her up to 50 times a day. And she talked about how she would initially talk to him to calm him down because in her mind he had an anger problem, and she needed to calm him down just so she could get through the day with a little bit of peace. But as that did not get whatever he was after, you know, the stalking escalated, and then he started some nasty messages. And some of them were threatening, going to put a bullet in your head, that he was going to continue following her around and find her wherever she goes, and that she was making him call her by acting the way she has been acting. And he definitely left messages saying that he was following her. So he also called at her work, and she got in trouble at her job, and was also calling and texting her mother. She did feel bad for him because he had lost his job and his family didn't have much to do with him. But after a couple of weeks, she did file for a protective order, and after the hearing, he, even while at the courthouse, he called her names and then even made a gesture across his throat. And since a protective order was issued, he has continued following, calling, and texting her. So, and also he would leave texts and messages suggesting that she was violating the protective order by constantly contacting him, and she felt this would make others not believe what was happening to her. So with that, let's go and use that case as an example. So I need to wait for just a minute while Terry shares the screen.
You know, CK, could you try to go up to that share button?
Which button? What does that look like?
That is one that looks like a computer monitor, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Uh-huh.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so is this live?
Yep, I can see.
Awesome. That was a lot easier. Okay. So this is the website that I showed you before, and I just hit the enter, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile, and it pops up a new window. And then there's just a cautionary statement to anyone doing this that things can be tracked on your computer. And then this is just sort of the terms and conditions, and this is just explaining sort of how long it's going to take, that it's research-informed tool, that it's not going to tell anyone what to do or anything like that. It talks a little bit about there are two narratives at the end, and that data will be saved in a table, but no identifiers will be saved, and that's just for feedback and research purposes. And then so the directions, and that just kind of giving people a preview of what's going to happen. It'll automatically date stamp the date up there. We said that Justin is a male offender. So I'm going to go on and type in his name, but you can put anything in here, Mr. Smith. You can put initials or just the first name, so whatever fits the situation. He was 21, and the same on the victim. You can put whatever Ms. Smith or whatever her name is. And like I said, here are all the different relationships we have. In this case, it's an ex-partner, and I'm going to fill this out as the victim. And to navigate the screen, you have to go within the program. So I just hit previous so I could go back and change that. Actually, I'm going to fill this out as a professional, and I'm going to put in here other researcher. And at any point, there's an exit and clear survey button down at the bottom. And it's broken up into shorter screens. So this is what I said before, because it's not the victim, it's not going to say you. It's going to ask all those questions. These are the SLY tactics or functions that we talked about earlier. So we know he's been monitoring her. He's been sent lots of invasion, unwanted contact. Has he intimidated or scared Julia? Yes. And in this one, we also have if there's a suspected. So, for example, the monitoring, tracking, or following. Sometimes we're not sure. So we put in that flexibility here. Has Justin significantly and directly interfered with Julia's life? So, yes, she got in trouble for work for his constant phone calls. And has he physically or sexually assaulted her while he has been stalking her? So not at this point. The duration, it's been about 2 months. I'm going to put, and so it uses the calendar to put in the date, however long that's been, and then it'll ask you. So basically, it calculated the time at 2 months exactly, and then asks, is that correct? And then it moves down and asks about intensity. So has he contacted or harassed her in more than one way? Yes. Has he bothered her at more than one location other than through her phone or computer? Yes. And has his behavior increased in frequency or severity over time? Yes. And a typical day, so how many days in a typical month has Justin initiated unwanted contact with Julia? He's calling her every single day. How many days does he approach or confront? None at this point. And how many days has he significantly interfered with her life? So about 5. And then this is the threat section we talked about. So has he left objects, made gestures, or sent things that were threatening but not direct threats? So yes, he did the cut across the throat. Has he threatened to hurt or kill her? Yes, he actually has done that as well. Has he described in detail? Maybe the bullet is detail. Has he threatened, harassed, or stalked others close to her? So yes, he's harassing her mother. Has he threatened to destroy property or sabotage her in other ways? Not directly. And has there been any proxy stalking? And there hasn't. And that'll be one of the factors. Well, she won't get 12 out of 12 for sure on the risk factor profile because there's no proxy stalking. So for safety, has his actions made her afraid or concerned? Yes. And she's concerned for her mother. And has she made life changes? She has. And does she believe Justin is capable of harming her or others close to her? She thinks he's extremely capable. And is she afraid or concerned about a significant financial or social impact? And she is definitely a concern about her job. Has he been directly and clearly notified that the stalking is unwanted, either informally or formally? So she had the protective order. She has not told him she wants no contact. Has Justin persisted in contacting her? Yes. And has there been a court, is there a court order, and has he violated it? Yes. And now we're just get into those contextual factors we talked about. So has he been controlling, jealous, or physically violent toward her or others in the past? So yes, he's been controlling and jealous with her in the past. And has he ever threatened or used a weapon on Julia, choked or strangled her, severely assaulted her? No. Does he have a criminal history, drug or alcohol problems, or serious mental health problems? So he has some, in the past, drug or alcohol problems. Has he thought about or attempted suicide? I don't know. Does he have a gun? Yes. He has a gun. And does Julia believe he is using technology to threaten, harass, stalk, or sabotage, to monitor her location, access personal accounts, post personal information, or pose as someone other than himself? So we're kind of getting at some of the more sophisticated technology because he's obviously using the phone. But at this point, I'd say it's unknown. Do messages from Justin suggest he feels rejected, humiliated, or degraded? Yes. That was left on some of those voicemails. And he definitely says that he's blaming her for making him act this way. And I don't know if he is unconcerned about severe consequences. It seems like he is because he's violating the court order. All right, so any potential upcoming events or situation. So again, I don't know. Does she feel she might have sent him mixed messages? Yes. Does she feel Justin is aware of the things he is doing upsets her, bothers her? Yes, she believes that. And does she feel bad for him? And she does. Does she feel there are limited or no consequences? Yes, he's continued to violate the order. And does she feel she's more vulnerable because there are things in the environment? So I'm going to say yes. She lives and works near him. And then this last page is where I said before where it just asks open-ended questions. So let's see. Justin actually worked with her father, and he threatened her father and was fired from his job. And the nice thing is there's spell check on this. Okay. And are there any safety concerns? And I'm going to put safety planning for the whole family is needed. So that went pretty quick, obviously. And this is where we're just generating the narratives. And I'm not going to wait for this, but this is what it looks like. It does take a few, 30 to 45 seconds to kind of generate the narrative. But this is what the Word doc of the narrative and risk profile looks like. And there's a big warning on the front, and then it just kind of tells the story in each of those sections that I talked about before. And in the part on the dynamic, we definitely talk about Julia responding to Justin's stalking, harassing, and threatening behavior, and that people being harassed, stalking, and threatened will do whatever is necessary for their own survival and the survival of others. However, they don't always know what to do. And this is where, again, some of that safety planning and working with advocates is critical. And what we got on this is 11 of the serious risk factors are present in this case out of the 12. And then here's where that statement at the bottom of this page that we talked about before, where I just typed that in. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this safety, but the safety narrative is sort of tailored for Julia to read. So, I mean, it can be used in however, expanded on or however, but it really is made to hand to the victim for her just to kind of also read it and understand it. Explains more about why those risks are risks and some different suggestions. And hopefully this is just a foundation. to work with for any advocates. And this one is 5 pages, so it's quite a bit longer. And then it also has the Stalking Resource Center website on there. So on that website too, I just want to point out we have a little short and sweet feedback on the website, but also certainly anyone can email me or call. So that's pretty much everything I have.
Great, thank you so much. I'll turn off your share so you don't have to worry about that. And then Stephanie and I compiled a list of questions that came through, so I think we'll go ahead and start with that.
Okay. One of the earliest questions was around the assessments that you were talking about before you went into SHARP. A question was whether these are recognized by courts and or law enforcement.
Well, I mean, I would assume that would depend on every jurisdiction is different. Those 3 other assessments that I was talking about are really more for, I mean, they're very in-depth reports. So whether or not a court would use that report or use that, I think that would just depend on the jurisdiction.
Okay, and can they be administered by advocates or mental health professionals?
The others, the 3 others that not SHARP, but the original, the other 3 I talked about. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first 2 that I talked about, those structured clinical judgment ones, they have different training requirements. So I think one of them can be, I mean, those you have to go and go through a certain service and purchase those, and as far as what's required to be able to administer it, you have to do some training for sure on one of them, and then the other one some training, and I do think they require some specific background, but I don't know because I don't administer them. The other one, the stalking risk checklist, that is out there. Anyone can do that.
Okay. There was a question also about cases where there isn't a threat, but the stalking or harassment is causing concern. And the question was, how can we advocate for law enforcement and courts to move forward in these types of situations when there isn't necessarily a history of violence or threat, but just this harassing stalking? Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, if the victims, well, I mean, there are multiple laws, and in Kentucky we have a harassment law, we have terroristic threatening, and I think most states have some versions of those. So I mean, to move forward on stalking, it has to meet those whatever legal elements of each state's definition of stalking, and most of those states have the element of victim fear or concern for safety. But what constitutes the rest of that law can differ.
Implied threat.
But, and in particular, how that threat is laid out. So in Kentucky, our law definitely says implicit or explicit threat, but other states are different. Some states may require an explicit threat. And so how all that's mapped out and what laws would fit would really just depend on the state.
Okay. Do you have any stats about the percentage of stalking cases that end up in death or serious physical violence?
Serious physical violence, no. The good news is that death in stalking cases is relative, it's very low. But what we do know is that a large number of women, so about 85% of women who were killed by their partner, for example, were stalked before they were killed. So we know that stalking is a factor along with other factors in that.
Okay. And can you discuss options for individuals being stalked, cyber especially, by stalkers residing outside of the U.S.?
Okay, so you're talking about cyber stalking outside of the U.S., so what options do you have?
Yes, do you have any suggestions?
I'd call the FBI.
Yeah, I would call the FBI, but I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, there were several questions regarding the questions on the tool about victims giving mixed messages. Jennifer says the mixed messages question seems like it might be hard to ask someone. It gets at victim blaming, and they wanted to understand also why it's necessary to include that.
Yeah, that one has been a hard one. When you look at the stalking research, and then there's not a ton, but there is some research on trajectory of stalking. And so sometimes the trajectory is impacted by how a victim responds. So it is important, and then you might say, so if you're responding, is it rewarding to the stalker? And I don't know. I mean, every situation is going to be different. Maybe that wording, I mean, we have worked, like I said, with Stalking Resource Center and with lots of people. Victims have done this, and we have tried to word that in the least, I mean, it's not at all about victim blaming. In fact, we do have to recognize that stalking victims often respond because what they want most of all is just to be left alone. They want peace. They don't necessarily know how to get it. And if she is responding, we need to talk about that and definitely safety plan about that. And and one example that just really hit me hard was a woman who said, he'll call me 100 times and I will ignore him, but when he starts calling my sickly grandmother and harassing her, I pick up the phone and call him. But so, of course, when she went to tell others, law enforcement, they saw that as her initiating. So how scared are you? And just really trying to just get at this bigger picture and put these things in context and make sure that we talk about them.
Okay. And I believe you answered the question about that the information isn't stored on this tool, right? It disappears?
Yeah, the reports disappear. They're gone. You cannot get them back.
Okay. All right. And and somebody had a question about what you meant by unsafe housing.
Yeah, that's just general perceived by the victim. So it may just be that she shared that house with him and she doesn't have the money to move. It might be in an unsafe neighborhood. I mean, that's just an option. Just that housing is an issue to consider in terms of that larger picture of safety planning.
Okay. Do you have anything to say about what could be done about proxy stalking when the perp is currently incarcerated?
Well, I think that a lot of the safety planning measures that we talk about, I think that's on a case-by-case basis, and I definitely think that doing some of the same safety, whoever is stalking you, especially if the primary stalker is in jail or prison, now you basically have two stalkers, and go on.
Well, I would like to add to that. Of course, I hope that they're recording jail calls. I think almost all jurisdictions do at this point. But if they are if the stalker, the primary stalker, is communicating with a proxy stalker, there's a good chance that something could be documented that would be useful. So I would, try to make sure that that's happening if that primary one's in jail.
But all those same things, documentation, collecting the evidence, taking pictures, the self-protection, the trying to get support, and letting people know what's going on, all of that, yeah.
Okay. Chris asks, whether the SHARP has reached a level of validation, and is it supported by individuals such as those mentioned previously as another tool in the tool belt for combating stalking offenses?
Well, this is our first entree, or we're just sharing, and as I've said, this is sort of, we're in our second level of feedback phase. I've had no funding whatsoever other than sort of just the fact that the university and the departmental support in terms of academic, but it's not been funded. And I would love funding for it to get it to a different level, but and that will be in that next step, but this is where we're at. So.
Okay. And I think you said that you can print the reports, right?
Yes.
And somebody wanted to know, how do you assess stalking without proof? For example, someone going to their car and having the mirrors moved, but no proof it was a certain person.
Well, that's why in a lot of those, questions we have that button suspected on there. And what I've learned from so many talented advocates who work with stalking victims is they basically say document everything, even if you're not sure of who is doing it or you don't have proof. Again, what we're showing are not these isolated crazy incidents, but probably more like a pattern of behavior over time. And how you get that proof is what is another thing to be thinking about. So if it's happening a lot, can there be a camera installed somewhere? And so making sure to partner with others who can help think through both the safety, help with the documentation, as well as to think through how we can get the evidence.
Okay. And finally, Jennifer asks, if we try this out, how would you like us to contact you with our feedback about how it's working in practice?
I think that there's a survey there you can fill out that I will get, or like I said, my email or a phone number. Either one of those would be awesome.
Excellent.
Well, looks like that finished up all the questions.
It certainly did.
Just in time.
Yeah.
So did you have anything kind of last words, that's not the greatest way to put it, but anything you'd like to conclude with? Thank you, Stephanie. Before we
I do. I just want to thank everyone for being online today. It's Christmas crazy month and all kinds of things going on, and I really, really appreciate everyone being here and being part of this, and I look forward to next steps on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, TK and Michelle. And thank you to all the participants that have joined us today. We will have this posted on our website in about a week. In about 30 minutes, you'll all receive an email from me for a follow-up that contains the verification of your attendance, and it has a link to our posted recordings, and it does have a survey that we'd appreciate any feedback. And with that, I will sign off, and happy holidays, everybody. Take care.